Another legal win for the Trump White House. The Supreme Court today siding with the Trump administration for now on the several thousand probationary federal employees that is trying to fire. Today, the court allowed the administration to keep the workers off the payroll while lower courts decide whether the downsizing efforts are legal. The High Court's decision blocks a ruling from a lower court judge that required the government to reinstate more than 16,000 probationary workers. Meanwhile, this is not the final word on whether the employees will be able to keep their jobs, but it will have a significant impact on them and the agencies they work for. Two liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson, publicly dissented. The U.S. stock market rebounding this morning, only to fall again after a turbulent 3 days of trading. This comes after the White House confirmed that President Trump's tariffs on China will go up to 104% at midnight tonight. And joining me now to discuss these latest developments is Republican Congressman from Georgia, Rick McCormick. Congressman Rick McCormick, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you today.
So first, the budget plan just passed the Senate, and President Trump has been praising it, saying on Truth Social that it has all of the elements we need to secure the border, enact historic spending cuts, and make tax cuts permanent. And tell us more about it. How do you think it's going to go in the House, especially given the gap between the Senate's $4 billion in cuts over 10 years versus the House's plan, which is pushing for $1.5 trillion?
Yeah, obviously that's concerning to a lot of members in Congress. We had a robust conference call today where there was a lot of debate over what we should do to approach this. Some people think that this is just to get us to the table where we can actually have a simple majority in the Senate to actually make the revisions necessary based on the president's budget, where he brings the rescissions and how we approve the ultimate bill. That's where the real cuts will be made. Other people think we need amendments now to get those numbers closer to, so that we're not talking about a roof, we're talking about a floor. We're talking about where we're going to actually draw a line in the sand as to what things need to be done in this bill. We all agree that we need to lock in the tax cuts, which really aren't tax cuts. They're maintaining the status quo that the Biden administration greatly benefited from, that President Trump passed at the end of his presidency in the first term. We need to make sure those things are locked in. We're going to make sure that happens. We're going to make sure that the border is secured properly. We're going to make sure the military is funded correctly, especially the standards right now into the world's tumultuous future. But what we don't agree on is the overall spending items. We're in trouble. We're approaching $37 trillion in debt. We have less than $5 trillion in revenue per year. We're paying $1 trillion in debt, just interest payment per year. If we don't do something dramatic, we will get downgraded again as a currency, and we will cease to be the world's currency standard. That would be extremely expensive to us, not only in interest payments, but also the future of whatever we invest in America. As we approach 30% of our revenue being spent on interest payments, that's a really bad indicator of the future of America. So we need to do something now. We need to get rid of a lot of fraudulent spending, wasteful spending. We need to get people used to working again and not just sitting at home. We need to make sure that all hands are on board when it comes to the future of America.
And Congressman, on tariffs, given your service on the House Armed Services Committee, how do you view the impact of President Trump's new tariffs on national security of our country? And do you think they're effectively strengthening the U.S. manufacturing, especially when it comes to critical defense components like steel and tech components? Or are you concerned that they might strain our relationships with some of our allies who are key to our military strategy?
Well, I'm not big on commodity tariffs because there's no way to negotiate that. You know, it's either a commodity or it's not. And if you do a steel tariff, for example, if you have a 25% tariff, that means you're going to force American manufacturers to buy more expensive steel. But when it comes to tariffs overall and its negotiation power with foreign entities, it's been extremely effective so far. We'll see how it goes with China in the long term. But right now, you have the entire EU offering 0 for 0 tariffs. That's an incredible leveraging point. That's going to help all Americans' industries to have access to the European market. It's going to make sure that we're treated fairly when we purchase products. It's actually going to deflate instead of inflate the cost of goods when it comes to foreign products that we purchase all the time. Same thing goes for Japan, India, Cambodia, Vietnam, Israel, all offering 0 tariffs. You've had in all over 50 countries come to President Trump and try to negotiate. that is an excellent leverage point for us as the strongest economy in the world to step off from. That's going to really strengthen our position in the world, our ability to have industry and at the same time to purchase at a lower price. That's a win-win-win. Hopefully it doesn't backfire on us when it comes to China and other countries that maybe try to flex on us, but we still are the big boy when it comes to world markets.
And to your point here, while we're seeing countries like Japan, India, even the EU coming to the U.S. to now trying to negotiate, China has fired back with its own 34% tariffs on U.S. goods. And as it's not backing down, as President Trump has called on them to do so, the U.S. will now enact another 50% of additional tariffs on top of course, what we have seen with the reciprocal tariffs announced last week now on China. Where do you think things will go next when it comes to U.S. and China trade? Are we going to be in a significant trade war with China now?
Oh, we're already in a trade war. If you think about how we've been treated unfairly for years, for decades, China has had a much higher tariff on us than vice versa. We have a bigger market than them. We are more valuable to them than they are to us. Of course, they have a lot of resources we need, components. They've been very strategic in their collecting of assets, whether it be lithium, cobalt, rare earth minerals. But we're going to fix that in the near future, I think. And I think they're going to be in a bad position if they don't come to the table with something that's fair. We're not asking for something unfair. We're asking for them to do the same thing to us that we're doing to them, which is a 0-0 tariff. That's free trade. That's what's always worked. To be treated unfairly as a protectionist market. They've been doing this in the World Trade Organization. They've been supplementing their businesses by government manipulation. It's put a lot of people out of business. It's not fair trade. They've been taken to court over 20 times and lost almost every single legal battle because they cheat on the World Trade Organization. It's about time that they be held accountable.
Well, I've heard administrations on both sides, past administrations on both sides of the aisle, complaining that China's unfair trade practices have hurt American manufacturers and even consumers and regular households. But when it comes to the actual impact of the new tariffs, though, for example, your district in Georgia includes some suburban Atlanta with a strong presence of tech, healthcare, and small business sectors. How do you think tariffs are expected to impact local employers and consumers in your district? And are you hearing some specific concerns from your constituents?
Luckily, all the concerns I've had have already been addressed. The people who have come to the table are from Europe and Vietnam. Most of my constituents were smart enough to shift away from China and towards Vietnam, Cambodia, other countries that offer similar products. I think that can only accelerate in the near future. If China continues to escalate this, India has the production capacity that China has. They have the manpower, they have the resource, they have the ability to obtain those things. And I think over the long haul, China will be shooting itself in the foot if they continue these unfair trade practices. So we're really in the driver's seat on this. They will be isolated, not us.
And before I let you go here, we have seen a bipartisan bill being brought up by Senators Grassley and Cantwell seeking to require congressional approval for new tariffs within 60 days. Do you support that? Should Congress reassert its constitutional right that it says over trade here?
I've been very vocal about this from the beginning. I want to see Congress take its equal footing with the president and the Senate. That's the way it's supposed to be. Our Constitution is very specific. Unless there's emergency powers, it doesn't matter if we're declaring war or laying taxes. That is something that's supposed to be constructed out of the congressional body, not the presidency. I respect what President Trump's doing. I think it's going to have a great and positive impact. But we don't want the next president to do the same thing in a negative way. So we want to make sure that we have balanced government the way it was intended in the Constitution. That's good for everybody, and I think it's the way our country was designed.
Congressman Rick McCormick, thank you so much for your insights here.
My pleasure. Semper Fidelis.
How will tariffs impact Americans' 401ks or retirement funds in the long run? To break it down, we're joined by political strategist Denny Salas and political commentator and journalist Scotty Hughes. Denny Salas and Scotty Hughes, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So first, there are some critics who say that tariffs could hurt 401ks and retirement savings. From your perspective as an everyday American, what's your take on this? First, Scotty can go first.
Well, let's just say it's only been a few days, and I think everybody's being a little dramatic when they're looking at their 401ks. I mean, you don't put a savings and spend your 401k in just 1 week, and you shouldn't necessarily gauge any decision-making based on what happens in the markets on 1 week. Yes, could long-term, if we keep up this instability? Absolutely, but that's going to happen with anything. And we've seen it several times in the past. Unfortunately, in the last 15 years, we've had several examples where the markets have gone haywire and it's affected 401ks. But in the long term, usually everything recovers. And I think we're going to have the same result, if not better, for those investments after we get over this initial dramatic hand to the head, absolute gasping just for effect at President Trump's very dramatic tariffs.
Danny, what do you think?
That's a good question. And full disclosure, I was a former stockbroker. That was my first job right out of college. So my perspective on this kind of matches Scotty, where it's like, listen, what you typically see in a market that's kind of overvalued, which I believe the stock market was actually overvalued at this point, is you see a market correction. And usually when you see a market correction, that means there's 6 months forward looking. So what you're seeing is what the typical value for the companies should be around 6 months from now. So they are pricing in kind of lower profit margins for a lot of these companies if these tariffs stay in place. So yes, you have to look at everything from the long term, that you shouldn't hyperventilate and then do panic sell or anything else like that. That's not what you should be doing, because again, that literally would just hurt your long-term growth in your investments. But at the same time, the market is pricing in lower growth. So that's exactly what you saw over the last few days in the markets themselves. Now, does that mean that tariffs will, like those tariffs will lead to that and come to fruition? Are you going to see lower growth? Not necessarily. What you also see just recently was actually something that Eric Trump said. Eric Trump, from his own personal experience, said, listen, I've seen this movie a million times in my life before. My dad will come out hard like this, expecting you to negotiate. And usually the last person in the room to negotiate with him is the person that gets the worst deal. So what you've seen typically now, especially for the Trump administration, is that this is just a starting point for negotiations for them to execute what their long-term strategy is going to be for our economy. And that's what I believe.
And speaking of the long-term perspective here, we know the administration says the tariffs are ultimately aimed at reshoring manufacturing and critical supply chains, and also addressing U.S. debt. Denny, do you see any alternative solutions to these problems?
It's a great question. I mean, look, you can't really lower the national debt or deficit if you don't target entitlement programs. And we're talking about Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. So you've seen DOGE, for example, target some of these programs on the margins, but not necessarily the actual big expense that they do create on our national budget. That being said, there are ways that you can do it. Is a theory that's floating around, and there may be some validity to it, is that by causing the market to kind of overreact to these tariffs, what you've also done is lower the 10-year yield that allows the Fed to refinance their current debt. So then that means they're paying out lower interest payments to our current bondholders. That could be true. That, to be honest, that could be true. That actually lowers and puts us in a more fiscally sustainable path in order to execute some of the other long-term goals that they're looking at. Look, and if you look at it as well as tariffs, let's just say if it stays in place. Let's say it stays in place for the next 17, 18 months, even longer than that. What you're also seeing is that this is really a tax on the wealthiest Americans, and it's a consumption tax. And what I mean by that is that the top 10% of the wealthiest Americans consume 70% of the annual goods that the Americans consume themselves. So who is actually paying these taxes? Disproportionately is going to be the wealthiest Americans. And by the way, on the other side of that, the bottom 50% of Americans consume fewer than 15%, less than 50% of the annual consumption in goods. So yes, they will be paying more if the tariffs stay in place, but it's not necessarily the debilitating, exercise and, the type of verbiage that you've been seeing from everybody in the economists and everything else is really targeted to the wealthiest Americans.
Scotty, what's your take on how tariffs will impact, for example, prices for Americans as well as the overall national debt for the U.S.?
We were thinking alike, because my colleague has done a great job of approaching this from a very professional standpoint and looking at the economics of it. I want to talk about how Main Street's going to handle it. Obviously, there is a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of fear mongering happening right now that our prices are going to go up, and they're going to go up at a great amount. That potentially could happen, but it's going to take a little bit of time to get to the store shelves. And also, I do unfortunately believe that some of these folks, as my colleague mentioned at the very top, might try to pass those prices initially down to their consumer. well, then you're going to price themselves out of the market. So they're going to have to be very careful if they try to make their products more expensive, because we live in a great time period right now where you don't just have one option on a shelf. Normally you have 7, 8, or 9. You already have a top level, a mid level, and then you have the store brand version of it. A lot of people might just be looking at those store brands. So until I start seeing the CEOs having to sell off their 14th BMW or maybe their 5th house in Denver, then I might get worried that this is actually going to have a very negative effect on the economy. But there is going to be possibly some short-term pain. But as my colleague pointed out, this is all about trying to bring those businesses back into the United States. And we cannot continue to complain, especially as conservatives, can't continue to complain about the entitlement programs, but then not give them options for jobs to get off those entitlement programs. So between the immigration situation and now we're going to have this situation of bringing manufacturing back to the United States, we have to give options for jobs from everybody from New York all the way to California and all of the flyover country between. That's where these manufacturing jobs can come back to.
Danny Salas and Scotty Hughes, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you for having us.